Over 100 years ago, the renowned educator Booker T. Washington had just become president of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. When he was walking in a very exclusive section of town, dressed in normal clothes, a wealthy white woman comes up to him in the street and politely asks him if he would like to make a couple of extra dollars chopping wood for her. She did not recognize him by his face. And thinking quickly off his feet, he realized that his schedule was open and he accepted the invitation. He followed the woman to her home and rolled up his sleeves and began to chop the wood. And when he finished chopping all of that wood, she asked if he would bring it into her house and place it by the fireplace, which he gladly did. And as he walked through her home, a little girl in the house recognized who he was, and later on would tell this lady. Well, as you might imagine, the next morning, this lady was horrified. And she went down to Mr. Washington's presidential office at the Institute, apologizing profusely. And he said, "It's all right, madam. Occasionally, I enjoy a little manual labor. Besides, it's always a delight to do something for a friend." She will never forget the humility that she experienced in this great leader. She'll never forget that invitation that he left her with as being friends, now that their paths have crossed one another. It's this whole loving your neighbor as yourself that comes to the light when we remember that no matter what path we're taking, whoever we intersect with becomes our friend and our neighbor that God calls us into community with. Throughout Jesus' whole ministry, he intentionally crosses paths with all types of people, with the wealthy and the outcast. And now that his popularity is growing so strongly, people are flocking to be near him as much as they can. And in Jesus' own great humility, he drew the whole world to himself so that he could help cut down those social and physical barriers which mankind had placed up to keep certain neighbors away. Jesus welcomed all to the table as friends. In Luke's gospel today, Jesus has been invited by some Pharisees to come and have dinner, and he's curious to see where people will sit. It's always interesting at any gathering to see where people choose to sit. And I've often found that in churches, people like to describe to me where they sit in the congregation. They give me directionals like north, south, east, or west, or near this column or underneath this flag, and I just politely nod my head because I don't have a clue of where they sit or who sits around them. My answer always is, I'm just glad that I have a place to sit. Have you ever experienced a time in your life when there wasn't a place for you to sit? I remember when I was young in third grade, I was having a series of surgeries at Duke Hospital in Durham, North Carolina. And the great joy when they would release me for Sunday morning, my parents would wheel me down the sidewalk from the hospital so we could attend church at Duke Chapel, that incredible, gorgeous space, only to be rivaled with the National Cathedral. And what made it so wonderful is that they had a place designated for me in my wheelchair. As a stranger, they welcomed me. But then when I would go back to my home parish in Wilmington, they had not made any accommodations, and I had to be placed in the aisle where I felt disconnected and unwelcomed in my own place of worship. Jesus said, when you're invited to a banquet, think of that humble seat. What would it be if we instead said to those who are unable to sit in our pews with us, let us make space for you? For making space for you, we want to think of ourselves being in that own position and to say we don't want to limit the space. We want you to have options as we have options so that you can feel welcomed, so you can feel connected. It's been a great joy this summer to watch a small committee who has looked at the accessibility of our pews in this church. A chance to not just create one more space, but to create 4 spaces in which people of all types of mobility can come and decide if they want to sit closer to the front or closer in the middle. And even though we have a designated place over here for such location, we have to remember the importance in our worship life that we can see the altar. For any setting in a liturgical setup, you should be able to place your eyes on the font, the initiation into our faith, and to place your eyes onto the altar, so that you're not sitting to the side, unable to see the celebration at the banquet table. For every time we gather around the table, it is that reminder that we are living into God's kingdom here and now. We are celebrating in the Eucharist as we will when our time comes at the heavenly table. Very soon we will have space that is open to all. And this committee has rolled up their sleeves like Mr. Washington and looked at ways that we can cut out some barriers that we have in our own worship life. And this is an amazing thing. For any time we can open our hearts and our minds to think about our neighbors and to see our neighbors as friends, it helps us to know that we are participating in God's kingdom coming amongst us. And to just think that no more will we have guests at weddings or at funerals that will have to sit in the aisle or sit off to the side and not to be able to see the Eucharist celebrated or to see the vows exchanged near the altar. That we say, we have made a space for you, a space that we would sit in and want ourselves. Jesus' challenge today in the gospel is to invite all and everyone else. And participating in the kingdom means that we live into the kingdom now. It reminds us of the future heavenly banquet, and it reminds us of the celebrations that we have in our lives together, where we continue to love our neighbors as ourselves, continue to make room for everybody. As those beautiful words in the epistle tell us today, let mutual love continue. Do not neglect hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some have entertained angels without knowing it. I have sat in the aisle, and now I have a fancy seat that I sit up near the altar. But to me, it's all just furniture. For the real celebration is being together as a family where everyone has a seat, where they can experience God's grace over and over again as we come together and chop down those barriers that are placed before us. For I believe that every time a barrier is cut down, we can hear the pleasing shouts of joy as God can bring in a little bit more of God's kingdom amongst us, and helps us to begin to see these as opportunities to be with our friends and love our friends as we have been loved ourselves. For it's creating moments in which we have been moved to change, which is why Christ came in the first place. As he hung on the cross as the ultimate sacrifice, so that all these lessons that he has taught his disciples and continues to teach us would sink in and carry forward into the world, bring in a different world of order than was currently in place at his time as well as at our time. Paul tells the Hebrews today that Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever, and that through him let us continually offer a sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruits of the lips that confess his name. Do not neglect to do good and share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Or as Mr. Washington said, besides, it's always a delight to do something for a friend.